I never believed one ordinary night could rearrange the way I saw someone forever. But that night, I discovered something about Elise that she had kept hidden from everyone in the house. And the moment I realized she'd seen me standing there, everything became impossible to ignore. I should have walked away. I didn't. It started on an unusually quiet evening. Dad was away on a 3-day business trip, and the house felt strangely hollow without him. No keyboard tapping from his office, no coffee mug hitting the counter, no absent-minded muttering while he worked. Only silence. The kind of silence that makes you notice every breath, every creaking floorboard, every distant sound you would normally overlook. I was sitting on the couch with a blanket over my legs, pretending to watch a movie. I couldn't focus. My attention kept drifting toward the staircase and the warm strip of light beneath Elise's bedroom door. My stepmother had always been difficult to read. She wasn't cold, but we had never been especially close either. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that made people instinctively respect her. Even when she said nothing, her presence seemed to fill the room. That night, soft jazz played upstairs. I told myself I was curious about the music. I told myself I needed water. But deep down, I knew I was looking for a reason to go upstairs. When I reached the hallway, I stopped. Her bedroom door was slightly open, just enough for the music to spill through. I hesitated, knowing I should keep walking. Instead, I took another step. Then I saw her. Elise stood beside her vanity, completely absorbed in something in her hands. It wasn't anything I had expected. There were photographs spread across the dresser, along with a worn journal and several folded letters. She looked different. Not the polished woman I saw every morning. Not the composed wife who always seemed to know exactly what to say. She looked vulnerable. Her fingers trembled as she studied one of the photographs. She brushed her thumb across it, then quickly wiped something from beneath her eye. A tear. I froze. Whatever she was remembering, it clearly hurt. The music continued softly in the background while she opened the old journal. She stared at one particular page for several seconds before whispering something I couldn't make out. I suddenly felt like an intruder. This wasn't a private moment I was supposed to witness. I should have left. Then the floorboard beneath me creaked. Elise stopped. Her hand remained on the page. Slowly, she lifted her head. For one terrifying second, I thought she'd turn around and catch me staring. Instead, she looked at herself in the mirror. Then her eyes shifted toward the doorway. Our eyes met through the reflection. Everything inside me went still. She knew. I knew she knew. Neither of us spoke. Her expression wasn't angry. It wasn't frightened either. It was something harder to understand, almost as if she had been expecting someone to discover that hidden part of her eventually. She closed the journal. Then she gathered the photographs and letters into a neat pile, carefully tying them together with a faded ribbon. I finally stepped backward. One step, then another. I returned to my room with my heart pounding, unable to explain why such a simple moment felt so enormous. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I kept thinking about the photograph. Who was in it? Why had Elise been crying? And why had she looked at me that way when she realized I'd seen her? By morning, I still had no answers. When I finally went downstairs, the smell of coffee and toast filled the kitchen. Elise was already there. She looked completely ordinary again. Her hair was loosely tied back, and she moved around the kitchen with the same calm routine I'd seen countless times before. "Morning," she said. "Morning." My voice sounded strangely unfamiliar. She placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of me. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. The refrigerator hummed. The coffee machine clicked. A spoon touched the edge of a cup. Everything sounded normal. But it wasn't. When I looked up, I caught her watching me. She looked away almost immediately. That tiny moment told me more than any conversation could have. Whatever happened upstairs, hadn't stayed upstairs. A secret had crossed the hallway with me, and now it was sitting between us at the breakfast table. I kept telling myself I was imagining the tension, that the night before had simply been an awkward accident and nothing more. But then Elise spoke again. "You didn't sleep much, did you?" I looked at her. She was stirring her coffee, eyes fixed on the cup. And suddenly, I understood. She wasn't asking because she was making conversation. She was asking because she already knew the answer. Maybe I had imagined everything. That was what I kept telling myself the next morning. Maybe Elise hadn't noticed me in the hallway. Maybe the look I'd seen in the mirror had meant nothing. Maybe I'd stood there too long, already expecting something strange, and my mind had filled in the blanks. Then she looked across the kitchen. For the briefest second, her expression changed. It wasn't anger. It wasn't surprise. It was recognition. "You didn't sleep well," she said quietly. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. "No, not really." She gave a small hum and turned toward the counter. "You were awake late." My heart skipped. "I couldn't sleep." The answer came too quickly. She didn't respond. Instead, she reached for an orange and began peeling it with slow, deliberate movements. The only sounds in the kitchen were the faint scrape of the peel and the ticking clock above the doorway. Then she placed a few slices on my plate. Sometimes old memories have a way of keeping people awake. I looked at her. She kept her eyes on the counter. I wanted to ask what she meant. I couldn't. For the rest of the morning, every ordinary interaction felt strangely loaded. She would start to say something, stop, and then change the subject. Once, I caught her watching me from across the room. When our eyes met, she looked away almost immediately. It felt as though we'd both entered a conversation without saying a single word, and I couldn't stop wondering what she thought I'd seen. Around noon, I found her standing near the living room window, staring at the rain. "You knew I was there last night, didn't you?" I finally asked. She didn't turn around. For several seconds, the only answer was the sound of rain striking the glass. Then she said, "You shouldn't have been in the hallway." My stomach dropped. "So you did know?" She finally looked at me. There was something exhausted in her expression. "I knew someone was there. Why didn't you say anything?" Her eyes moved toward the staircase. "Because I wasn't ready to explain." That answer followed me for hours. Later that afternoon, the rain grew heavier. The sky turned almost black, and the house felt sealed away from the rest of the world. I tried watching television. I couldn't concentrate. I tried reading. I read the same paragraph 4 times. Finally, I wandered toward the bookshelf, pretending to search for something I'd forgotten. That's when I noticed the photograph. It was sitting behind a row of old books. The same photograph I'd seen in Elise's room. I pulled it free. There were 3 people in the picture. Elise was much younger. Beside her stood a man I didn't recognize, and between them was someone who looked remarkably familiar. My hands went cold. I stared at the photograph again, certain I was seeing it wrong. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. Elise stood in the doorway. She wasn't angry. She wasn't surprised. She simply looked at the photograph in my hand and closed her eyes. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked afraid. "Where did you find that?" she whispered. I held it up. "Who is he?" She didn't answer. Instead, she walked slowly into the room and closed the door behind her. Then she looked directly at me. "Because of that photograph," she said, "your father and I almost never became a family." I felt the air leave my lungs. "What does that mean?" Her eyes dropped to the floor. "It means there are things about your father, about me, and about what happened before you ever came into this house that you were never supposed to know." The rain pounded against the windows, and suddenly, the strange feeling I'd had since that first night made sense. Elise hadn't been hiding something embarrassing. She had been hiding something dangerous. And somehow, without realizing it, I had just opened the door to a secret that had been buried for years. The rain still hadn't stopped, and by late afternoon, the house felt almost unnaturally quiet. I found myself standing outside Elise's bedroom with the weakest excuse imaginable. I needed to borrow a charger. Her door was slightly open, the same way it had been that night. I knocked softly. "Come in." She was sitting on the floor beside the window, surrounded by photo albums. Pictures were scattered across the carpet, like pieces of a life someone had taken apart and forgotten to put back together. She looked up and gave me a tired smile. "Hey, sorry, do you have a charger I could borrow? Mine died." "Of course." She pointed toward the nightstand. As I crossed the room, my eyes drifted toward the photographs. There were vacations, birthdays, family gatherings, and pictures from years before I had ever known her. Elise noticed me looking. "I was feeling nostalgic," she said. She picked up one photograph and studied it. "It's strange, isn't it? Looking at moments that once felt so important and realizing they're frozen forever." I crouched beside one of the albums. In one picture, Elise looked younger, standing on a beach with her hair blowing across her face. "You look happy here." "I was." Her answer came quietly. She turned the photograph over. "That was before I met your dad." There was something in her voice that made me look at her. "You never talk about your life before him." She gave a faint smile. Maybe because some parts of the past are easier to remember than to explain. The rain tapped against the window. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she opened another album. This was my first apartment. The photograph showed a tiny room filled with paint cans and half-finished canvases. "I thought I had everything figured out," she said. "Did you?" She laughed softly. "No, not even close." I smiled. "You look happier than you do now." The smile disappeared from her face. That was when I realized I'd touched something deeper than I intended. "Sometimes," she said, "people get so used to being what everyone needs that they forget who they were before." I didn't know how to respond. Then she looked directly at me. "Do you ever feel like you don't really know the people living in this house?" The question caught me off guard. "Sometimes." Her eyes dropped to the photographs. "I thought so." My attention sharpened. "What does that mean?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached beneath the album and pulled out the same old photograph I'd seen earlier, the one with the unfamiliar man. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she whispered, "There are things your father doesn't know I've kept." My stomach tightened. "About him? About all of us?" She slipped the photograph back beneath the album. I wanted to ask more, but she stood and carried the stack toward the closet. "Not tonight." "Why?" "Because once you know something, you can't unknow it." The words stayed with me after I left. By evening, the rain finally stopped. But the house didn't feel lighter. If anything, it felt as though the storm had moved indoors. Dad was still away, and Elise barely appeared downstairs. I heard her footsteps occasionally, followed by the opening and closing of drawers. I kept thinking about what she'd said. Once you know something, you can't unknow it. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I couldn't shake the feeling that the photograph wasn't the real secret. It was only the beginning. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate. They stopped outside my door. I held my breath. The handle moved. The door opened a few inches. Elise stood in the darkness, holding something in her hand. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she stepped inside. "We need to talk," she whispered. I sat up. "What happened?" She closed the door behind her. Her face looked pale. "Your father just called." My heart sank. "What did he say?" She looked down at the object in her hand. It was the old photograph. He knows someone found it. The room suddenly felt colder. How? Her eyes met mine. Because he asked me one question. I waited. She swallowed. Who else knows? And in that moment, I realized the secret we'd uncovered wasn't buried in the past anymore. It had started moving, and it was coming straight toward us. The rain had stopped, but the house still carried the heavy quiet it had gathered all day. I was almost asleep when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, careful. Then my bedroom door opened. Elise stood in the faint hallway light, her expression unreadable. "Are you awake?" she asked. "Yeah." She hesitated before stepping inside and quietly closing the door. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "I didn't want to be alone tonight," she finally said. I sat up. "Me neither." She came over and sat at the edge of the bed. The silence between us felt different now. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence of people avoiding a difficult conversation. It was the silence of two people who both knew there was something they had been refusing to name. She looked at me. "Are you okay?" "I don't know." She lowered her eyes. "Neither do I." That honesty broke through something I'd been holding inside all day. I wanted answers. I wanted to understand the photographs, the secrets, the strange sadness I'd seen behind her eyes. But more than anything, I wanted to know why everything between us suddenly felt so fragile. Elise reached for my hand. It was a simple gesture, nothing dramatic. Yet it made my heart race. "I don't know what happens after tonight," she whispered. "Neither do I." Her fingers tightened around mine. For several seconds, we simply sat there. Then she leaned closer and kissed me. It was brief and hesitant, more an admission than an answer. When we pulled apart, neither of us spoke. I looked at her, trying to understand what had just happened. "This changes everything," I whispered. "I know." She looked toward the window. "I've spent a long time pretending I was someone who didn't have questions, regrets, or unfinished pieces of the past." She turned back to me. "But I do. We stayed there for a long time, talking instead of pretending." She told me about the years before my father, about the choices she'd made, and the things she'd sacrificed. I told her how confusing it had been to watch someone I thought I understood suddenly reveal an entirely different side of herself. Eventually, the conversation faded into silence. We sat beside each other, exhausted by everything we'd finally admitted. Nothing felt simple anymore, and perhaps that was the hardest part. By the time morning arrived, pale sunlight was slipping through the curtains. I woke to find Elise sitting at the edge of the bed, already dressed, staring through the window. She looked as though she hadn't slept. "Elise!" She turned. Her expression was gentle, but there was something heavy behind her eyes. Morning. Morning. Neither of us smiled. The night before felt unreal now, like something that had happened in another life. Finally, she spoke. "We need to talk about what happens next." I sat up. "About Dad?" She nodded. "And about the secret." My stomach tightened. "What secret?" She reached toward the nightstand and picked up the old photograph. "This." I stared at it. She turned it over. Written on the back was a date and a name I'd never seen before. "Your father doesn't know I still have this," she said. "Who is he?" She took a slow breath. "Someone your father believed disappeared from our lives a long time ago." The room suddenly felt colder. "Is he alive?" Elise looked at me. "I don't know." That answer frightened me more than anything else could have. She placed the photograph in my hand. "But someone has been asking questions about him." I looked at the picture again. "Who?" She shook her head. "That's what we need to find out." A car passed somewhere outside. Then Elise's phone began to ring. She glanced at the screen. All the color drained from her face. "Who is it?" I asked. She didn't answer. The phone stopped. A second later, a message appeared. She read it once, then again. Finally, she handed me the phone. There were only 6 words on the screen. "I know you still have the photograph." I looked at Elise. She looked back at me. And suddenly, whatever had happened between us the night before wasn't the thing I was afraid of anymore. Someone else knew our secret. And they had just made the first move.